The phone rings. It is a scheduled call from the resource person assigned to our family by the government. We stated in our learning project that our educational approach was natural learning. So it didn't come as a surprise to me that they had questions. In fact, I was expecting it. And I actually appreciated that our resource person was open to discuss it instead of disapproving it on the spot. That certainly opened the door for a conversation. The purpose of the call was clear: to clarify the learning project, what is meant to be, what is supposed to follow. It's not an evaluation, neither a conversation about outcomes. Still, the structure of authority is present, subtly but unmistakably. There are moments of friction. Words and statements repeat and slip throughout the call. Teaching, following the progression of learning. They are introduced carefully but insistently. Explained as necessary because of expectations, because this is the legal thing to do. But those words land differently for each of us. Their contours remain blurry and ambiguous. The emphasis seems to be less on clarity and more on uniformity. In the middle of it, I raised a question that felt reasonable: whether the progression of learning is something homeschoolers are actually required to follow, given that the document is clearly written for teachers, embedded in classroom logic, structured around mass instructional delivery. There was a pause. Then the response came, firm and final. You are the teacher now. These words seem to be offered gently, perhaps as a way of making space for us, of situating our practice as homeschoolers within something recognizable to the system, as a solution that teaching gives a structure, safety, but also, ultimately, compliance. I noticed how quickly the word teacher sharpened the air. I felt its weight. My chest tightened. Even as I tried to see a positive intention behind it, the sentence landed with force. It carried weight, expectation, authority. It felt like a warning. You are the teacher now. It kept unsettling me, because unschooling has been for me a long process of stepping away from the teacher-student dynamic altogether. Not in rejection of responsibility, but in favor of relationship, attentiveness, and responsiveness. In favor of recognizing children, and more broadly all people, as active agents of their own learning. You see, as many unschooling parents and observers, most notably unschooling mom and author Sandra Dodd, have noted, the problem with teaching is that it assumes that learning is inseparable from it. It assumes that without adults leading, without adults teaching, there is no learning. It assumes that learners are passive receivers of knowledge. In institutional contexts, we see this dynamic unfolding. A learning plan often implies delivering. Someone teaches, someone receives, outcomes follow. Unschooling disrupts this model. It reframes learning not as the result of instruction, but as relational attunement. Not as leading, but as accompanying. The disagreement in the call was not personal. It was epistemological, a clash between models of learning, one linear and structured, the other emergent and responsive. So I felt the tension immediately. The statement felt both problematically empowering and threatening. On the surface, it sounded like recognition granted, authority conferred, a way of saying you count, you are legitimate, although let's admit that can also be condescending. And also threatening, because it implies that I will now be measured accordingly. Underneath, it felt like a quiet intimidation, even an act of defiance, because being labeled as the teacher has the risk of being read as, you signed up for this without having a credential as a school teacher. Let's see if you can do a better job than a teacher. So it does not simply name me. It both defies me and subjects me. It means I will now be assessed against expectations I never consented to, measured by standards never designed for homeschooling families, folded back into a system homeschooling and most explicitly unschooling and natural learning remain distinct from. The insistence on teaching also carries a particular assumption that trusting our children as active, autonomous learners represents a lack to be corrected, rather than a thoughtful and a heartfelt choice. As if naming ourselves teachers would elevate us. I didn't ask to be called a teacher. I don't consider myself a teacher. Neither I think I need to be a teacher for my child to learn. Let's also remember that teachers are prepared to deliver a curriculum for a classroom of 30 or more students in the context of mass education, not personalized education, the latter being what homeschooling aims at. What I asked was whether the progression of learning as a framework designed for institutional mass instruction was being quietly imposed on a non-institutional practice, such as homeschooling, that focuses on personalized learning, and thus differs and explicitly seeks to be an alternative to that model. The answer bypassed the question entirely. There was also another unspoken assumption and generalization moving through the call. That parents, once we become parents, apparently we don't read anymore. That we haven't already looked into legislation, frameworks, interpretations, and most importantly, instinct. That without explicit instruction, we would drift into negligence. Parents are being positioned as uninformed, as people who need reminding and instruction. Again, following the paternalistic teaching-learning diet. On this call, I felt my own unlearning being tested. Do I push back, or do I trust that a quiet refusal on my part can also be a form of clarity? Part of me wants to soften the meaning of the word teaching, to stretch it until it includes listening, noticing, responding. But another part rejects it altogether. It rejects the implication and assumption that learning must be deliberate, that it must be directed to be real, that without teaching there is no learning. But I decided not to rush to resolve the disagreement. I let it sit. During my deschooling process, I have tried to unlearn so much of my school conditioning, like the push to comply and perform competence, but also the reflex to correct preemptively. I have learned that clarity doesn't always come from contesting too quickly. Sometimes it comes from staying with discomfort long enough for meanings to circulate and middle ground to be found. This learning and unlearning are still ongoing. You are the teacher now. I didn't contest that statement, neither accepted it. I simply decided not to engage with it. I knew contesting it would not alter the situation, so I let it pass. But I did address the issue of following the progression of learning that led to it. I named the homeschooling regulation. I cited its language. No progression of learning is mentioned on it. Nonetheless, I show, without defensiveness, that I have read the progression of learning, and had even referred to it at times to translate the learning that has emerged naturally on my child, but that I had done so for me and out of curiosity and choice, not out of obligation. Choice is not taken lightly among most of us in the homeschooling community. Most of us know that choice is what allows homeschooling families to thrive in the face of so much uncertainty within our families and within the system. Hence, choice is not negotiable. And that was the battle I subtly chose to engage in during the call. I wanted to highlight the difference between required and recommended, between following and observing, between what's customary and what's legal, between obligation and choice. Not to contest, but to clarify where our understandings could potentially overlap. When frameworks are imposed because it's the law, despite the law's ambiguity, to me it's a conversation that needs to be had. Such urgency to resolve the ambiguity of the law by referring to known frameworks and practices, such as teaching, is revealing. It shows how institutions and their intermediaries prefer familiar forms, even when alternative practices are legally permissible. Again, it shows how the goal is not so much clarity, but uniformity. There is a brief pause. The tone shifts slightly. A small space was created. In that moment, our unschooling practice remained ours, unaltered by the imposed identity of "you are now the teacher." The interaction became a kind of mutual understanding without internalization. The system could register a response, and I maintained my own logic and rhythm. Both worlds remained real. My child's learning flowed in its relational and scripted way, and the state could mark that attention and responsibility were present. Bridging becomes a critical practice here, an act of translation that protects unschooling from being absorbed into school-like logic, while still remaining legible enough to move through bureaucratic walls. Still, the underlying assumption remains intact, that without being recast as a teacher, parents are not serious enough, structured enough, accountable enough. That homeschooling parents must be guided, corrected, elevated. This is where the condescending attitude lies, not in hostility, but in the presumption of deficiency. It's not overt, not aggressive, but rooted in the old colonial belief that legitimacy comes from resemblance, not otherness. And schooling has led me to unlearn the reflex to accept these framings while still being able to be patient enough to hold space and complexity. This unlearning is relational and still ongoing, and it extends into encounters like the one that took place during this call. Bridging is nuanced. I feel myself translating between worlds, between unschooling as lived practice and unschooling as something that must be legible to the state to avoid constrainment. I reference the legislation and the progression of learning. I show calmly, clearly, that I have read it. But when I cited it, I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't complying either. I was trying to be understood, to show that our choices are not born out of ignorance, but out of intention. Not because I needed to validate our family's choices, but because not sounding legible to the system risked being constrained by it too. Bridging by making unschooling legible to the system doesn't mean that one has to accept institutional imposed frameworks, labels, and identities, like being a teacher. Bridging then becomes a careful holding of both sides without collapsing into either one. The social sciences provide an interpretive framework to what unfolded here. Anthropologically speaking, this is a boundary moment, where dominant norms meet alternative ways of knowing. What's being clarified is not just a plan, but which worldview it will quietly serve. The imposition of the identity of the teacher here is not neutral. Michael Foucault's work on governmentality clarifies the move further. Power does not only prohibit, it produces compliant subjects by shaping identity itself. By naming me a teacher, I'm not forced to teach per se. I'm reframed until teaching appears inevitable. The appeal to legality intensifies the pressure. The homeschooling regulation is invoked not with precision, but with ambiguity. Guidelines and frameworks like the progression of learning seek to be imposed just in case, and because of that ambiguity. Not because they are clearly mandated, but because uncertainty is managed through control and uniformity. Anthropologist Marilyn Strathern calls these anticipatory audits. Rules enforced not because they are clearly mandated, but because institutions cannot tolerate the uncertainty that falls outside familiar forms and frameworks. Again, the issue here was not clarity, it was alignment. The resource person occupies a structurally ambivalent role. What political scientist Michael Lipsky and other policy anthropologists like Susan Wright describe as a street-level bureaucrat, a human intermediary between the state and, in this case, families, who must balance care and control, softening regulation through relationship. They function as both support and surveillance. Their task is to ensure compliance, but also to maintain relationship. Invoking teaching as a stabilizing concept resolves this tension for them neatly. It reassures the system while appearing to empower the family. And schooling is thus permitted only insofar as it resembles a school closely enough to calm institutional anxiety. But unschooling disrupts this logic at its core. It rejects the idea that learning must be caused rather than accompanied, that adults must assert authority through teaching in order for learning to happen and knowledge to be valid. It reframes adults not as instructors, but as co-participants in meaning-making. The call ends on steady ground. No one has won, and that wasn't the goal, but something has eased. We live with shared understanding, not perfectly aligned, but respectful enough to move forward. The learning project was approved and remains flexible, capable of holding difference. I realized that the call mattered, not because it resolved every disagreement, but because it made space for them without collapsing the relationship. Maybe this too is part of the unlearning, finding a way to stay in conversation when the language of learning itself is contested across different logics of responsibility, and trusting that mutual understanding can emerge without forcing learning or each other into predefined forms. I left the call thinking less about disagreement and more about translation, the slow, careful work of making ways of living intelligible to systems without flattening them. I feel the weight of the work that doesn't show up in plans. The reading, the unlearning, the careful bridging. I'm learning that unschooling is not just about supporting a child's curiosity. It is also about standing firmly in practice while systems gently and persistently try to reshape it. The deeper work, the invisible work, is also learning how to bridge without surrendering, to speak across power without translating life into compliance, without surrendering the integrity of how we live, of how we learn, of how we trust our children and ourselves as active learners.